The sheriff searched the valleys for 2 days, but it was the church bell that led them to the cabin. Inside, a mountain man slept by the fire. His arms held both girls like they were his own. The first scream didn't come from the forest. It came from the sheriff's own chest. Sheriff Cade Mercer dropped to his knees, palms tearing against pine needles as he searched the earth for something, anything. A ribbon, a footprint, a sign. The sun was dropping fast behind the ridge, dragging light with it like a curtain being pulled tight. Night was coming, and with it, the chill that bit through bone and broke even grown men down to weeping. But Cade didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel anything except the silence where two little voices should have been. "June, Maisie," he called again, throat raw. "Girls, it's Papa." No answer, just the wind, just the awful quiet of trees that knew how to keep secrets. Behind him, 3 deputies stood pale-faced and helpless. One of them, young Amos, opened his mouth to speak, but Cade raised a hand before any words could be formed. "Don't," the sheriff said, voice like a cracked board. "Not unless you found something I haven't." They hadn't. They de-scoured the hills from River Bend to Copper Ridge. The girls had vanished sometime after the Sunday sermon, last seen chasing a stray dog toward the woods. That was nearly 2 days ago. The townsfolk had lit candles. The church bell had rung once for each hour past. And Cade, who'd survived a war and buried a wife, was beginning to face the one fear he'd never spoken aloud. That he might bury his daughters too. He clenched his fists against the ground, biting back the sound building in his throat. Then a sound rose, not from him, not from the wind, but distant and slow, as though the mountain itself had stirred. A bell. Not the one from town, a different one. Lower. Older. The men looked at each other. "That's from up near Hollow Creek," said Amos, voice tight. Cade stood, mount up. They rode like spirits torn loose from earth. The horses labored against the incline, hooves cracking frost as they climbed. No one spoke, not even when they passed the black stump where old tales said witches once cooked the bones of liars. Not even when the moon broke out like a knife across the tree line. Cade's jaw clenched as he rode, and in his mind all he saw were 2 sets of eyes, one green like a summer field, the other brown and soft like honey tea, both growing dim with each passing hour. The bell rang again. Once, twice, then silence. When they reached the ridge, they saw it, light, faint, and flickering from a cabin tucked deep beneath a crag of stone and pines. It looked more like a burrow than a home, the kind of place that didn't want to be found. Cade dismounted before his horse even stopped, gun drawn. The others followed close behind. He didn't knock. The door creaked open with a low groan. Warmth hit him first, then the scent of firewood, pine, and something faintly sweet, like stew that had been left to simmer too long. Then he saw them. June, Maisie. Curled together like pups, cheeks flushed with heat, arms tucked beneath a thick fur pelt. And beneath them, the chest of a man. Not just any man. A giant. He was sitting up, but only barely, slouched in a rough-hewn chair near the fire, one massive hand still resting on the edge of the pelt, the other cradling the girls like they were carved from glass. His beard was thick and shot through with gray, his coat lined with wolf fur and stitched with scars. His boots were too large for town men, his hands calloused like someone who'd fought trees and won. But it was his face, weathered, still, and silent, that made Cade pause. He didn't wake when they entered, didn't stir. Maisie shifted slightly in her sleep, nuzzling closer against his ribs. Cade lowered his gun. "Get the doctor," he muttered to Amos, still staring at the scene before him. Now. They didn't touch the girls. Not at first. It felt wrong, like stepping into a dream too delicate to disturb. But eventually Cade moved. He knelt beside his daughters, brushing June's tangled hair back from her face. She blinked slowly, eyes clouded with sleep, and murmured something that sounded like Papa. "I'm here," Cade whispered, voice breaking. Maisie stirred too. She yawned, stretched her tiny arms, then looked up at the mountain man's still chest. "SHHH," she whispered. "He's sleepin'." Cade looked to the man again. He wasn't breathing like someone in rest. It was deeper, slower. And around his wrists, bare skin showed raw red bands, as if he'd been bound. The doctor arrived 10 minutes later, so did half the town. No one had seen the man before. No one knew his name. But the story they began piecing together over the next few hours would freeze hearts harder than the snow still clinging to the mountainside. The girls remembered little. "We followed the puppy," June said, voice trembling. "Then we got lost," Maisie added, "and it got dark." They'd wandered cold and barefoot for what they guessed was hours. June had tried to be brave. Maisie had cried. Then they saw him. "He didn't talk," June whispered. "Not at first, just picked us up, wrapped us in his coat." Maisie nodded. "He walked with us, carried us both. He was so warm." "Did he hurt you?" Cade asked gently, heart in his throat. "No," both girls said at once, horrified by the question. "He gave us his food," June whispered. "Didn't eat none of it himself." Maisie clutched her father's hand. "He sang to us, a little, not words, just sounds." Cade didn't understand it. How had a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself stumbled upon his daughters, alone and freezing, and chosen not just to help, but to give them everything? The doctor finished checking him over. "He's not dead," she said. "Just barely here, malnourished, sleep-deprived, and those marks, someone tied him up, recently." "Why?" Cade asked. But the question rang empty. No one had answers. Only more questions. They carried him into town in the same cart that brought firewood from the hills. The girls wouldn't leave his side. Not even for their own beds. So the pastor opened the church doors, and they laid the man down on a cot beneath the window where morning light always hit first. Cade sat nearby through the night, hands folded, Bible resting on his lap unopened. "God," he whispered, eyes fixed on the stranger, "I don't know what kind of man you've dropped in our lap, but he gave me my girls back. That counts for something." The town buzzed with whispers by dawn. Some said he was a trapper, gone too long into the woods. Others thought outlaw. One woman claimed he was the angel of the Lord in disguise. But Cade knew better than to trust gossip. He wanted the truth. So when the man finally stirred, just after sunrise, voice like a rusted hinge creaking open, Cade leaned forward. "What's your name, son?" The man blinked, then rasped one word. "Boone." The church fell silent. Everyone knew that name. Or thought they did. But what none of them knew, not yet, was what he'd lost. Or what he'd done to try to get it back. Boone didn't open his eyes again for hours. The pastor said it was the body's way of catching up to the soul. The doctor said starvation and cold had a price, and Boone had paid too much of it. But Cade didn't leave. He sat in that wooden chair by the cot in the church, the pews behind him long emptied, the light from the stained glass window tracing slow arcs across the floor. The only sound was the tick of the pastor's old clock and the rustle of Maisie's doll skirt as she leaned against her father's leg, watching Boone with a kind of quiet reverence. "Papa," she whispered, her breath soft as feathers, "he's still warm. That means he's staying, right?" Cade ran a hand over her curls, his throat thick. "That means he's still fightin', darlin'. That's all it means for now." He didn't know what answer he'd give when Boone opened his eyes again, what questions he'd ask, what judgment he'd need to weigh. All he knew was that the man had come down from the mountain like a ghost, with Cade's girls in his arms, and now lay in their church like some sacrifice nobody had asked for. And it was Cade's duty, as a father, as a sheriff, and as a man, to figure out what kind of soul had come to rest in his town. By the time Boone stirred again, the moon was back. He didn't wake in a rush. He didn't sit bolt upright or gasp for breath like a drowning man returned from the deep. He simply blinked once, then again, then let out a slow breath as if acknowledging he was still in a body that hadn't yet let him go. Cade leaned forward, slow, careful, like approaching a wild horse that hadn't decided yet whether to kick or run. "Boone," he said, voice low but firm, "you're in redemption in the church. You've been out cold since yesterday. You remember anything?" The man didn't speak right away. He turned his head slightly, taking in the flicker of candlelight, the quilt folded neatly across his chest, the wooden beams of the ceiling, and finally the shadow of Cade Mercer, who sat like a stone near his bed. "I remember girls," Boone said, his voice rough as gravel after rain. "Cold crying." "They're safe," Cade said, "because of you." Boone's lips parted like he might say more, but then his face twisted, not in pain but in something else. A memory, maybe. A regret that ran deeper than wounds. Cade saw it flicker through his expression like stormlight behind clouds, and he waited. "They didn't deserve the dark," Boone said finally. "No child does." He tried to sit up but winced and collapsed back onto the cot. His arms trembled as if even the air pressing down on them weighed too much. Cade moved to help him, but Boone raised a hand, warding him off. "I'll manage," he said. "You've already managed more than most," Cade said, "but I reckon we need to talk properly." Boone's eyes slid to the window. The church bell tower loomed above them, and somewhere outside, a hawk cried into the fading dusk. "I figured you'd come with questions," Boone muttered. "I'm the sheriff," Cade said. "It's my job to ask 'em." "Go ahead then." "All right." Cade leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "You found my daughters in the woods. You kept 'em safe. But you looked like you hadn't eaten in weeks, had your wrists torn from ropes, and you nearly died in that cabin. So the first thing I want to know is, who tied you up and why?" Boone's jaw clenched. For a long moment, Cade thought he wouldn't answer. But then the man's eyes dropped to his hands, scarred, thick-knuckled, but trembling now, and he let out a breath like it cost him to release it. "There were 3 of them," Boone said. "Men I once called friends, rode with them after the war, helped build their traps, dig their cellars, shared meat when the winters came hard, thought I knew 'em, thought they knew me." "What happened?" Boone stared at a knot in the wood floor. "I left. Didn't like what they'd become. Didn't want blood money or stolen horses. Didn't want to be part of their kind of living. That didn't sit right with them." "They tracked you?" He nodded slowly. "Waited till I was asleep. Took everything but the fire. Said if I loved peace so much I could freeze in it. Tied me up and left me in the snow." "And the girls?" "I heard them crying sometime after the second night, thought I was delirious. But then they kept crying, so I worked the rope, took half a day, nearly lost my fingers, found them under a ridge shivering and scared, didn't think twice." Cade rubbed his chin. The story matched what June and Maisie had said. Still, something gnawed at the edges of it. "You ain't from Redemption," he said, "but you knew where to find shelter, that cabin." "Used to be mine," Boone said, "years ago before I left folks behind." Cade didn't push further, not yet. He stood and nodded. "I'm grateful for what you did, more than you know, but there's folks in town that'll want answers. Some already asking if you lured the girls out, then spun a tale." Boone's eyes flared, and for the first time, Cade saw something dangerous flicker behind them. "You think I'd hurt children?" "I think pain makes people suspicious, and fear makes 'em mean." Boone said nothing. He simply turned his face toward the wall and closed his eyes. By the next morning, the town was a hive of murmurs. Children peeked through the church windows. Women whispered behind handkerchiefs. Men stood with arms crossed outside the general store, shooting glances at the steeple like it was a prison. Only one person walked into that church without hesitation. Her name was Mrs. Talbot, widow of the old blacksmith, and she didn't knock or wait. She marched through the doors, set down a pot of stew, and pulled a chair beside Boone's cot. "I don't care if you wrestled a bear or married a witch," she said plainly. "You saved those girls, so you'll eat, and then you'll talk to the children at the schoolhouse. They need to see what a hero looks like." Boone blinked at her. "I'm no hero, ma'am." "Well, that's the first sign you might be," she said, scooping stew into a bowl. "Now hush and eat before I find a spoon and feed you myself." By noon, the tide began to shift. Mrs. Talbot told everyone who'd listened that Boone was no threat. The girls refused to leave his side, even napping beside his cot with arms draped over his chest like he was a living shield. And Cade watched it all quietly, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. But Boone didn't care about town opinion. That much was clear. He didn't ask for kindness. He didn't protest suspicion. He simply sat, ate what was given, and kept one eye always on the window, like he expected the world to come crashing in. And it did. 3 days later. It started with a horse. A black one. Riderless, lathered in sweat, galloping through Redemption's southern trail like death itself was on its heels. Cade heard it before he saw it. By the time the deputies had calmed the beast and read the brand on its flank, the sheriff's face had gone cold. "That horse belongs to Buck Jenner," Amos said, pale. "Boone's old riding partner," Cade muttered. "Reckon he's nearby." Cade nodded, "And if he is, trouble's not far behind." They didn't have to wait long. Just after dusk, as the sun bled out across the hills, 3 men rode into Redemption. Dirty, grizzled, with eyes like men who'd stared too long into fires they'd lit themselves. At their head rode a man with a scar down his cheek, a rifle across his back, and a grin that never reached his eyes. "Even in," he said, sliding off his horse in front of the sheriff's office. "Name S. Jenner. I'm looking for a thief. Big man. Quiet. Used to ride with us before he found his heart in the dirt." Cade didn't flinch. "This ain't your town, Jenner." "Maybe not, but the man I'm huntin' is in it, and I've got claims to settle." Cade folded his arms. "He ain't leavin' with you." Jenner laughed once, low and dry. "We'll see." As he turned to walk toward the church, his men fanned out behind him. And Cade knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The church bell rang once, sharp and clean. It wasn't a signal of faith that evening, nor a call to gather in prayer. It was a warning. Cade had posted young Deputy Wheeler in the bell tower after the Jenner boys rode in, said if he saw any of them head toward the church, he was to pull the rope hard and loud. Now the bell swung like a heartbeat, sending vibrations down into the soil. Cade was already moving before the second chime. He pushed through the church doors with a force that made the hinges squeal, his boots echoing across the wooden floor. Boone was on his feet, not standing fully, not yet, but braced against the wall, his frame still gaunt but his spine straight. He looked less like a patient and more like a stone pulled from the river, pale but solid, and his eyes, they weren't tired anymore. "They're here," Cade said flatly. "I know," Boone answered, already pulling his coat off the peg. Maisie and June stirred in the corner, still half asleep on the makeshift cot. Eliza Dawson, the pastor's wife, stepped in front of them protectively, hands on both their shoulders. "I'll get them out," she whispered. Boone didn't look at the girls, didn't touch their hair or offer one of the soft, guttural lullabies they'd taken to napping under. He simply nodded. "Don't let 'em see," he said. "Whatever happens, don't let them see." Cade opened the church door, just as the first shadow fell across the steps. "Jenner." He wasn't smiling now. His eyes roamed across the cross above the threshold like it was an insult. "Seems you've made our brother into a saint," he said, voice slithering into the room. "Didn't know Redemption was so generous with her mercy." "He's under my protection," Cade said. "You make one wrong move, and the only bells ringing will be for your graves." Jenner chuckled, but it didn't sound real. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching against frost. "Come on, Boone," he called out, voice louder now. "You and I both know this ain't gonna end in a hymn. Step outside and let's finish what you started." Boone walked into view, emerging from the side hallway like a man approaching judgment. His coat was buttoned now, collar pulled high. His beard cast shadows across his cheekbones, and he looked taller than he had any right to after 3 days on the edge of death. "Buck," he said simply. Jenner tilted his head. "I'll still know my name." "You didn't change it," Boone replied. "No reason to. Ain't ashamed of what I've done." "Maybe you should be." For a moment they just stared at each other, old stories written across hard faces. Cade could feel the weight of it pressing on the room. Something about their stillness made the pews feel closer, like the church itself had leaned in to listen. Jenner spat into the grass. "You ran out on us," he said, voice tight. "Took what wasn't yours." "What'd I take?" Boone asked. "You know good and well." Boone's hands curled into fists. "I took nothing but my life back." Jenner stepped up the last stair, now face to face with Boone at the threshold. "You took her," he hissed. Boone didn't flinch. "She wasn't yours to keep," he said quietly. A murmur rippled through the few townsfolk who had begun to gather across the square, drawn by the ringing and the voices. Jenner's hand dropped to his belt, resting just above the revolver. Cade's moved just as fast. "Don't," the sheriff said. "You pull iron in front of this house, you won't live to regret it." Jenner looked between the two of them, Boone unarmed, Cade steeled, and then slowly he took a step back. "This town has bought itself a storm," he said. "You keep him here, you keep his trouble too." He turned to leave, but before he did he spat once more, this time at Boone's boots. Boone didn't move, just watched him go. Inside the church, silence returned like a heavy fog. Cade poured 2 cups of strong coffee from the pot warming on the stove near the altar. He handed one to Boone, who took it with both hands. "You gonna tell me the rest?" Cade asked after a long sip. Boone stared into his cup. "She was a midwife," he said slowly. "Lena, lived up near Widow's Peak. Used to patch the boys up when they came back from hunts. She knew how to mend more than flesh. She could quiet a room just by walking into it. First time I heard her laugh, I forgot where I was." "You loved her," Cade said. Boone nodded. "She loved me too, that was the problem." He let the silence stretch. Cade didn't interrupt. "Buck had plans," Boone said. "Big ones, smuggling, trade routes through old trapper tunnels. He wanted Lena at his side, said it'd give him respect. She didn't want it, said she'd rather heal than harm. Said the world had too many knives already. He didn't take that kindly." Boone set the coffee down on the pew beside him. "She came to me, said she was leaving, asked if I'd go with her. I said yes." "What happened?" "They caught us 2 nights out. Buck lost his mind, tied me up, made me watch while he took her away." Cade's breath caught in his throat. "She scream?" he asked softly. Boone's face was stone. "She didn't scream, she looked at me, told me not to beg, told me to live." Cade sat back, arms heavy. "What happened to her?" "I don't know, I think." Boone's voice cracked. "I think he buried her somewhere they'd never find." A long silence settled. Then Cade said, "Why'd you come back down now?" Boone stared out the stained glass window. Morning was beginning to leak across the horizon. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I was just walking. After they left me to die, I wasn't aiming for anywhere, just forward. Then I heard the girls, and the rest, it just happened." Cade ran a hand through his hair. "This town is gonna turn into a crucible if you stay. You know that." Boone nodded. "Let it." "You planning to run again?" "I'm done running." Cade looked at him long and hard. Then he stood. "I'll keep you safe, Boone, but I need something in return. Name it. When the storm comes, and it will, I need you standing next to me. Not behind, not gone. You saved my girls, now help me save this town. Boone nodded. Done. 3 nights later, the storm did come. But not the kind that howled with wind or froze blood in the bone. This storm came with hooves and fire. Jenner and his men didn't come quietly. They lit the feed barn as a warning, tore the roof off the dry goods store, sent one of Cade's deputies back to town half-beaten with a message carved into his vest. Boone or blood. Cade called a meeting in the church. Boone stood near the door, arms folded, jaw set. The townsfolk argued, pleaded, panicked. Some said give him up, others said stand their ground. But Mrs. Talbot rose from the back and walked right to the front. He held those girls like a father holds his own, she said. That's all I need to know. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was strong enough. Boone would stay. And redemption would fight. The snow had mostly melted by the time the townsfolk began building barricades, but the ground remained hard and cold, as if the earth itself refused to soften to the threat that loomed on its horizon. The men worked in silence, heaving barrels and old crates into place along the main street. Sheriff Cade oversaw the defense with a sharp eye, barking orders sparingly, choosing instead to lead by doing, digging, hauling, and fortifying until his hands blistered. Boone didn't ask what needed doing. He simply did it. Every morning before the others stirred, he was already moving, chopping firewood, reinforcing fence lines, dragging water from the well, even helping the widowed Mrs. Talbot carry bags of flour into the chapel's basement. And though whispers still followed him through redemption, they'd begun to change in tone. The children watched him with wide eyes, less afraid now. Some even approached him with shy questions about the woods, about animals, about whether bears could really smell fear. He answered softly, without smile or frown, never once brushing off a question. Cade watched it all quietly. The change, the slow shift in how Boone was seen, not with reverence but something close to acceptance. Not a man forgiven, not yet, but one perhaps understood. Still the threat remained. And it wasn't just whispers anymore. It came in the form of warnings nailed to the edge of town, crudely scrawled notes signed by Buck Jenner, daring Cade to make good on his promises. 1 week, the latest note read. Then we take him or we take everything. No signature this time. Just a bloody handprint at the bottom. Cade crumpled it and burned it in the stove. That evening, Boone sat alone in the church. The pews were empty. The air carried a faint scent of old wax and cedar. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass in a pale glow, casting fractured color across the wooden floor. He didn't pray. He wasn't sure he had that right anymore. But he sat in stillness, watching the candles flicker at the altar, remembering the warmth of Lena's voice, the way her hands had moved when binding wounds, the way she had said his name, soft but sure, like it belonged to something better than what he'd been. Behind him, the door creaked. He didn't turn. He already knew the footsteps. Cade walked down the aisle, slow and deliberate, stopping at the end of Boone's pew. He didn't sit. "Town's holding," he said, "but barely. You feel it too, don't you?" Boone nodded. "They're afraid," Cade continued, "but it ain't you they fear now. It's what followin' you might cost. I didn't ask them to follow. They didn't ask to be tested, neither." Boone looked up finally, and his eyes, deep-set, shadowed, held something Cade hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not fear. Resolve. "I'll leave," Boone said. "Tonight. Won't wait for the week to end." Cade's brow furrowed. "You think they'll stop if you go?" "No," Boone answered, "but they might hesitate, might give you a better chance." Cade sat down heavily beside him. "My girls sleep easy for the first time in months. They whisper your name like a bedtime story. You walk away now, Boone, they'll learn the wrong lesson. That monsters win. that the ones who protect them vanish into the dark. Boone didn't reply right away. He stared at his hands. They looked older now, not from age, but from what they'd carried. "I can't lose more, Cade," he whispered. "I've lost enough." "So have we," Cade said quietly. "So have we all." He stood, resting a hand on Boone's shoulder. "Stay, fight, not just for you, for them." Boone closed his eyes and nodded. By sunrise, the town had changed. Word spread quick that Boone would stay, that redemption would stand with him. The schoolhouse shuttered its windows. The church's steeple was reinforced with planks and sandbags. Old men who hadn't touched a rifle since the war now sat with them, cradled in their laps. Cade worked through the night with Boone, drawing maps in the dirt behind the sheriff's office, marking places of high ground, choke points, sightlines. Boone knew the land better than anyone, where the ridges narrowed, where the frost lingered longer in the shadows. It was the first time Cade had seen him speak so much, point, instruct, move like the weight of hesitation had been lifted from his frame. But Boone didn't speak of himself. Not once. Not until the sixth night. The wind blew sharp and mean that evening, rattling windows and whipping through the eaves of the chapel like a trapped spirit. Inside, Boone sat near the stove, feeding small logs into the fire. Maisie and June sat cross-legged nearby, listening intently as he carved a small figure from a scrap of wood. "What is it?" June asked, leaning closer. Boone didn't look up. "Wolf." "Why a wolf?" Maisie asked, hugging her knees. Boone paused. Then he said, "Because wolves survive, even when they're alone." The girls nodded solemnly. Cade stood in the doorway, watching them. Later, after the girls had been tucked away with Mrs. Talbot, and the candles had burned low, Boone remained at the fire. "Lena was with child," he said softly. Cade looked up. "I didn't know," Boone continued. "She never told me, or maybe she did and I didn't hear it right. But when I found her scarf on the edge of the ravine when Buck said she'd gone quiet, I knew I hadn't just lost her." Cade said nothing. He didn't need to. Boone's voice cracked. "I should have died then, thought I had, but I didn't, and now." He looked at the carving in his hand. "They call me a wolf, but I wasn't always alone." Cade nodded, his own throat tight. "You ain't alone now." Boone didn't smile. But he didn't look down either. The morning of the seventh day came wrapped in silence. No crows. No wind. Just frost and the distant echo of hooves. They came at dawn. Buck Jenner led them. 12 men, all hard-eyed and hungry, rifles strapped, fire in their boots. They rode in slow, like they didn't expect resistance, like they'd done this before and always walked away grinning. But redemption didn't flinch. They were waiting. And this time, the bell didn't ring in warning. It rang in defiance. Cade stood in the middle of the street, shotgun resting across his forearm. Boone stood beside him, coat flapping in the cold wind. Men lined the rooftops. Women waited in the church with buckets of water and bundles of bandages. Children huddled deep in cellars, their ears pressed to the floor, listening. Jenner pulled his horse to a halt 10 yards from Cade. "Well," he drawled, "seems like you brought the whole town to your funeral." Cade didn't blink. "Last I checked, funerals don't usually talk back." Jenner sneered. "You've got 10 seconds, he said. "Send him out and we walk. Refuse and we burn your town to ash." Boone stepped forward. "You want me, Buck? I'm right here." Jenner's eyes flickered. "Thought you'd come crawling." "I came standing." Boone drew in a breath. "But I ain't yours anymore, and you ain't walking away this time." Jenner smiled like a man who'd won already. "We'll see." The first shot came from the saloon roof. A warning. The second dropped one of Jenner's men from his saddle. Then the street exploded. Gunfire cracked like thunder. Horses screamed. Dust rose in thick clouds. Cade moved like he'd been born for it, shouting orders, pulling fallen men to safety, keeping Boone in sight. Boone fought like a mountain had risen in defense, steady, unyielding, precise. He didn't waste bullets. He didn't curse or scream. He simply moved, protected, endured. And when Jenner finally dismounted, rifle in hand, and charged down the street toward the church, it was Boone who stepped into his path. They met in the middle of the dust. No words. No pleasantries. Just fists. The fight was brutal. Jenner struck fast, wild, filled with hate. Boone took the blows, returned them slower but heavier. Blood flew. Bones cracked. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched in silence, knowing something deeper than revenge was playing out. When Boone finally knocked Jenner to the ground and stood over him, chest heaving, he didn't lift the rifle Cade had tossed him. He just looked down. "You took everything from me," he said, "but I ain't talkin' redemption from itself." Jenner spat blood. "You ain't got it in you." Boone's voice was low. "No, but I've got something else." He stepped back. Cade cuffed Jenner and dragged him to the jail. The battle was done. Redemption had chosen. That night the town was quiet. The wounded were tended. The dead were few. Boone sat alone on the chapel steps, staring out at the stars. Behind him, the girls giggled in their sleep. And for the first time in years, Boone didn't hear Lena's voice in mourning. He heard it in peace. The morning after the standoff felt unreal. The streets were quiet, but not in mourning, more like a town waking from a nightmare it wasn't sure was truly over. Smoke still curled from a few burn barrels, and the front of the general store was half scorched from where a bottle of oil had landed and flared up before Cade and his deputies put it out. But the fire hadn't spread. The blood had been mopped away. And the bodies, just 3 in total, had been laid out behind the church with pine branches covering their faces. Boone stood on the steps of the chapel with his coat unbuttoned and his sleeves rolled up. His knuckles were bandaged from the fight with Jenner, but he barely seemed to feel it. His face was more hollow than bruised. His eyes were clear but still distant, like he hadn't yet stepped fully back into the world after what he'd faced. The townsfolk gave him space. Not out of fear, but out of something else now. Respect, maybe. Or guilt. Cade approached him with a coffee mug in hand, steam rising faintly in the cool air. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Boone shook his head. "Didn't need to." "Me neither." Cade handed him the cup. "You held back yesterday. Could have put Jenner down for good." Boone took a slow sip. Didn't want redemption's first real choice to end in blood. Cade studied him a moment, then nodded. "He's locked up. Won't be getting out without a judge riding in. Could take a few weeks." "Not long enough," Boone said quietly. "Don't disagree." They sat on the steps in silence for a while, listening to the town slowly come back to life. Somewhere down the street, Mrs. Talbot was barking orders at 2 young boys hauling water. Across from her, the barber hammered his broken window frame back into place. The world kept turning as it always did, but Boone felt a weight settle differently on his chest now, like something had shifted beneath the surface. Not lifted, not yet, but loosened. He turned his gaze to Cade. "What do I do now?" Cade exhaled through his nose and leaned forward. "You're not gonna like my answer. Try me. You live." Boone's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "You don't run," Cade went on. "You don't vanish. You stay. You help fix what's broken. You give them something to believe in that ain't built on guns or fists. You become a man they can look at without seeing a shadow." Boone looked down into his cup. "You think they'll want that from me?" "They already do," Cade said. "They just don't know it yet." By midday, the town square was bustling with more life than it had seen since before winter. The people had lost sleep, peace, and in some cases, blood. But they hadn't lost everything. and that mattered more than anything else. Children played again, at first timidly, then with more laughter. Women traded goods openly again without fear hanging over their heads. Even the bell tower was silent, its tension spent for now. Boone spent most of the day working beside Cade and Amos, helping haul lumber from the old mill up north. They patched the front of the dry goods store, re-roofed the stable, and even cut a new beam for the church's side door. Boone didn't say much, but his hands moved with purpose. The pain of the past still clung to him, but for the first time since redemption had taken him in, he moved like a man with someplace to be. That night the townsfolk gathered for a meal. They laid out long tables across the square, planks resting on barrels and crates. Mrs. Talbot made stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Amos's mother brought fresh bread. The children tore through biscuits like wolves, and even the pastor let out a rare chuckle after someone poured a little too much cider into his tin cup. Boone stood off to the side at first, plate in hand, unsure whether to sit or disappear. But it was June who marched up to him, took his hand, and led him to the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You saved us," she said simply before he could protest. "You sit." So he sat. And the people let him. No cheers, no toasts. Just a place at the table. Later, after the candles burned low and the dishes were cleared, Cade and Boone stood at the edge of the square, watching the firelight flicker against the old buildings. "You ever think about settling?" Cade asked. Boone looked at him sidelong. "You offering?" "I'm saying it's a thought. Town's got space. You could make something here." Boone didn't answer right away. He watched the children chasing fireflies and the women folding up quilts and baskets. "Settling means roots," he said, "means building something that can be taken. Everything worth keeping carries that risk." Boone rubbed his thumb over the edge of his belt. "I don't know if I remember how." "You learn," Cade said, "the same way we all do, one day at a time." The next morning, the girls were gone. Gone like the wind had taken them. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No screams. Just empty beds and a note pinned to the chapel door. "You stole her from me. Now I take something from you, 1 for 1. There was no signature. But Boone didn't need one. His hand clenched the paper so tight it tore in half. Maisie and June. Taken. He didn't even wait for Cade to speak. "I know where he's gone," Boone said, already strapping on his coat. "He won't hurt them, not yet. He wants me." Cade was right behind him. "We ride together." Boone paused. His voice was low. "This isn't just another ride, Sheriff. He's not aiming to win. He's aiming to bury every trace of who I was, starting with them. All the more reason I'm coming." Boone didn't argue again. By nightfall, they were riding hard for the pass, back into the dark country Boone had once fled. Back to Widow's Peak, where the first loss had begun, where the reckoning would end. They rode through the night, stopping only once to water the horses. Boone didn't eat, didn't drink. He moved like a man being pulled by something deeper than fear, deeper even than rage. He said nothing the entire way up the mountain trail. But Cade saw the change in him. He wasn't running anymore. He was returning. Widow's Peak had once been a logging camp, years before Boone had ever met Lena. Now it was a graveyard of rotted beams, half-collapsed cabins, and blackened stumps. The wind up there moved different, slow and heavy, like it was weighed down by memory. They dismounted in silence. Boone knelt near the old well at the center of the ridge. "He'll be close," he said. "Always loved theatrics. He'll want a stage for what's coming." Cade checked his rifle. "And you?" Boone stood. "I want my girls back." They found them inside the only standing cabin, tied gently, almost respectfully, to chairs near the hearth. A fire burned low, keeping them warm, but the sight of their small faces asleep, unaware of the danger surrounding them, hit Cade like a hammer to the gut. Boone moved first. He stepped into the cabin, hands raised. "Buck," he called softly. No answer. Then from the rafters came the sound of boots. Buck Jenner dropped from above like a spider, quiet, sudden, deadly. He landed behind Boone, knife flashing, but Boone turned faster than Cade had ever seen him move. The blade sliced the side of his coat. Boone didn't flinch. He grabbed Buck by the wrist, twisted, and slammed him into the wall. "Where'd you bury her?" Boone growled. Buck spit blood. "Who?" "You know who." Buck sneered. "You never found her, you never will, that's your punishment." Boone drove his fist into Jenner's ribs, dropping him to the floor. Maisie and June stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Papa," Maisie murmured. Boone froze. It was the first time she called him that. Cade stepped forward, gently untying the girls. "You're safe," he said. "He's here." Boone stood over Jenner, breathing heavy. "I should finish it," he said. Jenner chuckled through a bloody mouth. "Go ahead, prove them right, that you're still just the beast I made." Boone raised the knife. And paused. He looked back at Maisie. At June. Their eyes wide, scared, watching. He dropped the blade. "No," he said, "I'm not who you made, not anymore." He turned away. Cade cuffed Jenner without a word. The girls ran to Boone, wrapping their arms around his legs. He dropped to his knees, pulling them close. And this time he did weep. They rode back slow. With the girls bundled in blankets, Jenner shackled, and redemption waiting on the horizon. Boone didn't speak for most of the ride. But as the first rooftops came into view, he looked at Cade. "Do you believe a man can be more than what he's done?" Cade nodded. "I believe a man is what he chooses when no one else is watching." Boone looked forward again. And for the first time in a long, long time, he smiled. They crossed the final ridge as the sun began to rise behind them, casting redemption in a golden wash that made the town look softer than Boone remembered. The rooftops still bore scars from fire, the chapel windows were patched with canvas, and the westward fence still leaned like it hadn't decided whether to stand or fall. But somehow, it all looked more like home than any place Boone had ever known. Maisie and June slept, bundled against Cade's saddle. Boone rode beside them in silence, his frame slack from exhaustion, but his eyes never left the horizon. He didn't ask how long the girls had been gone. Didn't need to. Their quiet breathing told him enough. They were safe, and that was all he'd ever asked of the world. Buck Jenner, bound and bleeding, rode behind them on a borrowed horse. His wrists were tied to the horn, his head slumped forward. He hadn't spoken once since Boone dropped the knife in that old logging cabin, and Cade had no intention of coaxing words from him. Whatever Jenner had to say would come later, before a judge and the eyes of the whole town. When they finally reached the main street, people gathered as if pulled by a shared instinct. They emerged from homes and shops, shawls wrapped tight, boots half-laced, faces worn from days of fear, but every eye widened when they saw the girls. Maisie lifted her head first, blinking sleep away. Then June, rubbing her eyes and squinting toward the familiar shapes that slowly stepped forward from the growing crowd. Mrs. Talbot was the first to move. She ran, skirts gathered in her hands, eyes filled with tears that didn't spill. "Oh, thank the Lord," she whispered, scooping them from Cade's horse and holding them like the world might break again at any moment. The rest of the town exhaled in one long breath. Boone dismounted without a word. He took Jenner's reins and pulled him down with a single tug, dropping him hard into the dirt. The townspeople flinched, but Boone didn't raise his hand again. He simply handed the reins to Deputy Amos, then stepped back. "Put him in the holding cell," Cade ordered. No visitors, no light. Amos nodded and hauled Jenner away, the crowd parting like a river around a fallen tree. Boone turned, ready to disappear back to the chapel maybe or to the forest's edge, but Cade caught his arm. "Stay." Boone hesitated. The townspeople were still watching, unsure. Then Maisie reached out from Mrs. Talbot's arms, her fingers stretched toward Boone. "You promised you'd come back," she whispered. "I did," he said, barely audible. "And you promised you'd stay." Boone's jaw clenched. He looked to Cade, who said nothing. Then back at the girl. "I did," he repeated. She reached out again. This time he took her hand. By noon, the town was alive again. The girls were checked by the doctor, found healthy though chilled. Mrs. Talbot refused to let them out of her sight, tucking them into the cot at the back of the chapel and reading aloud from her worn Bible while the fire crackled low. Boone sat outside, leaning against the chapel wall with his knees drawn up and his hat pulled low. Cade joined him a short time later with a flask of warm cider and a bundle of letters wrapped in string. "Mail came," he said, handing over the bundle. Boone blinked. "For me?" "No, for the town, but figured you could help sort it." Boone took the bundle, fingers rough against the twine. They sat in silence, Boone thumbing through the names, some familiar, some not. Then he paused, holding a letter addressed in tight, deliberate script. To Boone. No last name. No return address. He stared at it a long time. "You want me to step away?" Cade asked. "No," Boone said, "it's time." He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper worn at the edges. It smelled faintly of herbs. Boone unfolded it with care, and as he read, his breath caught. "Boone, they told me you died years ago, that the cold took you, or that you ran so deep into the forest no man could follow, but I never believed it. I knew if you'd had a choice, you'd have come back. And now I hear whispers from traders, a town called Redemption, a man who saved children, a man who walked away from vengeance. If it's you, I forgive you. If it's not, then someone's out there walking the path you tried to take. That means something. May you find peace, however far you walk. L." Boone's hand trembled. He folded the letter again and tucked it into his coat. Cade didn't ask. Didn't need to. That night Boone returned to the jail. Not to confront Jenner, but to speak. Cade opened the cell and let him in alone. Jenner sat on the floor, back against the wall, hands bound in front of him now instead of behind. He didn't look up as Boone entered. "I buried her," he said suddenly. "You asked. I figured you'd come back for the answer." Boone didn't sit. He stood like a tree planted firm in the dirt. "Where?" "In the grove by the ridge. The one with the 3 pines twisted like a braid. She's beneath the tallest. No marker, but I remember where." Boone nodded once. Jenner looked up, eyes bloodshot. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." "You never do," Boone said. Jenner laughed bitterly. "I hate you." "I know. But I hate myself more." Boone didn't answer that. He turned to leave. "You should kill me," Jenner said behind him. "End it." Boone paused at the door. "I did," he said quietly. And left. The next day, Cade rode out with Boone to the grove. It was just as Jenner said. 3 pines, their trunks twisting upward like a prayer. Beneath the tallest, Boone knelt and dug with his bare hands until he found what he was looking for, a small silver locket, tarnished but intact, pressed into the soil like a promise. Inside was a lock of hair. Lena's. Boone didn't cry. He buried the locket again, gently, then covered the ground with his coat. "She's at peace," Cade said quietly. "I hope so," Boone replied. They rode back in silence. The weeks that followed were slow, healing. Boone took up work with the blacksmith, repairing hinges and door frames, rebuilding carts. He didn't speak much, but his presence no longer carried weight like it used to. It carried steadiness, a quiet sort of strength. The children adored him. Maisie clung to his leg every Sunday after church. June asked him to teach her how to carve. He obliged, shaping small animals from soft wood, leaving them on porches with no names attached. Mrs. Talbot told everyone who would listen that God had brought him down the mountain. Boone didn't argue. Then the judge arrived. He came by wagon, cloaked and tired, asking for records, testimony, the prisoner. Jenner was brought before the chapel-turned-courthouse. The trial was short. The evidence overwhelming. Boone testified once, voice calm and flat. "I was his friend," he said, and he betrayed every part of that word. Jenner didn't speak. Not even when the sentence was read. Life imprisonment, to be served in the Territory's Stonehouse prison. Boone didn't watch them load him into the wagon. He stood at the edge of the square, eyes on the sky. That evening, Cade found him on the hill behind the chapel, watching the sunset. "You could leave," Cade said. "No one would blame you." "I know, but you're not going to." Boone shook his head. "I think this is the place." "For what?" "To stop running." Cade smiled faintly. "You already did that." Boone glanced at him. "Then maybe this is where I learn to walk again." At sunrise the next morning, Boone built a marker in the chapel yard. A simple stone, no name. Just 3 letters carved into the base. LMH. He didn't explain it to anyone. But the pastor placed flowers there each Sunday. And the girls sometimes left pinecone or small birds carved from scrap. It became part of the town. Like Boone. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But surely. Steadily. Spring crept into redemption slow as molasses. The frost lingered stubbornly in the shaded gullies, but daffodils broke through near the chapel, and the creek behind the old schoolhouse babbled louder now, newly fed by snowmelt from the upper ridges. Folks were planting again, potatoes mostly, a few tried corn, and windows that had been boarded all winter now swung open to let in the wind and the smell of wet dirt. Boone watched it all with quiet wonder. He hadn't expected to see spring again, not after Jenner, not after the long, dark winter of doubt that had lived in his ribs for years, but now it came to him slowly, like a stranger approaching with no weapon in hand. He found himself rising early, not out of fear but out of rhythm. He liked the sound of the forge coming alive, the blacksmith's son hammering iron in steady beats while his mother stitched leather beside the coals. Boone helped there now, regularly. His hands, once used only for carving, now reshaped metal, hinges, horseshoes, wagon parts. He said little, just worked. And at the end of each day, 2 girls ran to meet him. Maisie and June. They started calling him Pa now, though not always. Sometimes it slipped out by accident, other times on purpose, and they'd study his face afterward, waiting for the crinkle of his eyes or the small twitch of his mouth that meant he'd heard and approved. He never corrected them. Not once. Cade visited often, not with questions or demands, just with coffee or quiet. Sometimes they'd sit on Boone's small porch near the edge of town and watch the clouds roll like cattle across the sky. Boone had moved into the old corner cabin, the one the town had rebuilt after the fire. It was modest, just 1 room, a stove, a cot, and a table, but he'd carved a swing for the girls, and that was what mattered most. "I never saw this coming," Cade said one afternoon, sipping coffee. Boone glanced at him. "Saw what?" "You here settled, quiet." "I ain't quiet." "You are," Cade said, smiling. "But not like before. This ain't silence from pain, it's from peace." Boone didn't reply right away. Then he said, Some silences don't need breaking. Cade nodded. That they don't. In May, the judge sent word. Jenner had taken his own life. Hung himself in the Stonehouse prison, with a frayed rope meant for drying laundry. No note, no request for burial, no belongings. Just a name scrubbed from the books and an empty cell. Boone read the letter without expression. He folded it neatly and burned it in the fire. Later that night, he took a walk to the chapel yard. He knelt by Lena's stone. I don't know if I'm supposed to feel anything, he whispered. I thought I'd feel lighter, but I don't. He paused. Maybe that's good. Then he rose and left a small carving beside the marker. A wolf curled around two sleeping cubs. He didn't return to that spot for weeks. Redemption was changing. The church held more people now, not fewer. Weddings returned. A new schoolhouse was planned. Even the saloon saw less brawling and more card playing. People smiled more. Not always, not perfectly, but enough that Boone began to trust the quiet. He still woke sometimes gasping from old dreams, hands clawing for a knife that wasn't there. But then he'd feel a weight on his chest, Maisie curled against him, fast asleep, or June's hand still clutching his shirt from where she'd fallen asleep mid-story, and he'd breathe. He'd close his eyes again. And the dark would pass. Then came the storm. Late June, a real one this time. Thunder rolled down the mountains like cannon fire. Lightning split a tree behind the stable, and the wind tore shingles clean from the sheriff's office. It lasted all night. Boone and the girls rode it out in the cellar, wrapped in quilts, telling stories by lantern light. June brought her carved rabbit. Maisie wore one of Boone's old shirts as a nightgown and insisted it made her braver. They laughed. Laughed so hard that Boone forgot for a moment why he used to fear the night. By morning the storm had passed. But it left behind more than damage. It left behind someone else. The boy couldn't have been older than 9. He was found just outside town, soaked through, face bruised, his lips cracked from cold. He carried a note pinned to his chest. He said redemption is where the good men are. No name. No explanation. Cade brought him straight to Boone. The boy didn't speak at first, just stared at the fire while Maisie and June fussed over him with blankets and biscuits. Boone watched him carefully. Finally, the boy looked up. "You're the one who saved the girls," he said. Boone nodded slowly. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny, broken carving. It was rough, unfinished. But Boone recognized the shape. "A wolf." "Who gave you this?" he asked. "My brother," the boy whispered. "He said you'd understand." Boone stared at it. Then slowly, carefully, he took the carving. "I do," he said. The boy's name was Caleb. His brother had died weeks before, ambushed by outlaws near the border. Before he passed, he told Caleb to find redemption, to find Boone, said there were still men in the world who remembered what right looked like. Boone took him in. And how he healed. One evening in early July, a rider came to town. He wasn't from the hills, wore a red coat, union cut, faded with dust and long travel. He dismounted at the well and nodded politely to Cade, who was oiling his rifle on the front step of the sheriff's office. "Looking for a man called Boone," the stranger said. Cade straightened. "What for?" The rider pulled a letter from his saddlebag. "From the Eastern Territories," he said. "Something about land, a claim he made years ago." Cade took the letter and read it. Then he smiled. "Ain't no claim like that out here," he said, "but I'll see it gets to the right hands." The rider tipped his hat and moved on, none the wiser. Cade walked it up to Boone's cabin later that night. They read it together at the table, kids asleep in the corner. It was a claim to property deep in Montana near the Bitterroot Mountains, issued in Boone's name, backdated, legal. He could go. He could leave. Build something new. Start again. Boone folded the letter slowly and set it aside. I already have everything I need, he said. Cade didn't press. He simply reached across the table and squeezed Boone's arm. I reckon you do. In the years that followed, redemption flourished. The schoolhouse doubled in size. A second general store opened, run by Caleb and June when they were older. Maisie took over the stable and turned it into something finer than anyone imagined. She raised foals like they were kin, trained even the meanest of mares with a touch as soft as her mother's had once been. Cade retired. He handed the badge to Amos, who wore it with pride and a healthy dose of humility. Cade still kept an eye on things, never too far from trouble, always near when needed. Mrs. Talbot passed one winter, quietly, in her sleep. The whole town gathered in the chapel. Boone carved her a cross of walnut and ash and placed it beside Lena's stone. He didn't speak at the service. Didn't need to. His work was her eulogy. And Boone. He never left. He aged slow. The kind of man who seemed carved from the same rock as the mountains behind him. Children grew up around his stories. Some were true, some weren't. None of them mattered more than the look in his eyes when he told them. He never married again. But he didn't walk alone. Not with Caleb, June, and Maisie always nearby. They were his family. Chosen. Forged in fire, tempered in love. On the 15th spring since he'd come down from the mountain, the church bell rang one morning, not in alarm, but in honor. Boone had passed quietly in his sleep. The girls, grown now, with children of their own, found him in his chair, blanket tucked around his legs, wood shavings scattered across the floor. He'd been carving again. A wolf curled around 3 small cubs. Cade helped bury him beside Lena, beneath the pines. No long sermon, just a few words spoken low. Some men die unfinished, others finish the work God gave them. Boone did. Years later, travelers came through redemption, drawn by stories passed from town to town. They asked about the mountain man who saved the sheriff's daughters. The man who once walked into town alone, carrying nothing but silence and sorrow, and stayed long enough to build something stronger than any lawman ever could. Some said he was just a myth. A tale mothers told to make children believe in second chances. But if you followed the ridge west of town, past the grove of 3 braided pines, you'd find a stone marker carved with only one word. Boone. And if you waited long enough, you'd hear the wind whisper through the branches like a lullaby. And if you were lucky, you might see a wolf at the edge of the trees. Watching. Protecting. Still there. Still home,